How old are you? Really? Your rounded, globe-like skull has existed for 200,000 years. Your long legs and arched feet made their appearance a couple of million years ago. Your rotating shoulders allowed ape ancestors to climb in and out of trees 20 million years ago. And your fingernails? They evolved close to the time of the dinosaurs. 16 million years ago, your early primate ancestors started to lose their claws for flat nails, allowing them to grip and grasp rather than scratch and dig. Around the same time, your eye sockets began to face forward so you could judge the distance to the next branch. 3 times older than that are the hairs on your body and the mammary glands beneath your nipples. They evolved 200 million years ago in the earliest mammals, alongside your molars, incisors and canines, developing from teeth that used to all be the same. Twice as old are your lungs, evolving over 400 million years ago in the ocean, before any finger or toe had walked the earth. Older still is your jaw, and your heart changed from a simple tube to a chambered structure around the same time your eyes developed retinas, 500 million years ago. And so draw a line back through generations of your parents and grandparents, back through each one of their ancestors, and you will find direct relatives that are apes, fish, and even the creatures that predate all of them. Your lineage, your family tree, your bloodline extends even further than this, billions of years back to the dawn of life on Earth. Your body today is filled with features that developed in vastly different times, in vastly different creatures. And indeed, your existence today is only possible because of those who came before. Your ancestors had to develop and use these new tools to survive for billions of years in order to create their greatest great-grandchild. You. And so, how did it happen? What did you evolve from? In November 2007, the Photon M3 rocket returned from space. It had spent 12 days orbiting our planet, but its passengers were not humans. They were tardigrades. Tardigrades, affectionately known as water bears, are some of the toughest animals on the Earth. Although microscopic, they can withstand extreme temperatures, 1,000 times more radiation than other animals, and 30 years without food or water. Understandably, many think of them as being virtually indestructible, and so in 2007, scientists decided to put that idea to the test. They sent tardigrades into orbit on the exterior of the Photon M3 rocket. There, they experienced extreme acceleration and violent vibrations as the rocket launched into space. And once they reached orbit, their conditions didn't improve much. Now they had to contend with zero oxygen, rapid heat loss, and high radiation from the sun. No other living organism has survived such an ordeal, but astonishingly, most of the tardigrades did. Life finds a way. Species like these are particularly fascinating from an evolutionary perspective because although our planet seems perfect for sustaining life, this hasn't always been the case. The Earth is approximately 4.5 billion years old, but for most of its existence, it was an inhospitable place by the standards of our time. Indeed, for a long period after its formation, our planet was a molten ball of magma with an atmosphere as welcoming as a stellar nebula. Even after several hundred millennia had passed, most life as we know it couldn't have held on. And yet, we do know from geological evidence that life evolved relatively early in the planet's history. By 4.4 billion years ago, Earth had cooled enough to form a solid, rocky surface. However, the air was still toxic, made up of deadly gases like hydrogen sulfide, methane, and carbon dioxide. With very little oxygen in the air, it might seem impossible that life could ever have evolved. But Earth had something that would spark a revolution. Water. This simple element composed of 2 hydrogen atoms and 1 oxygen, is vital for all life on the planet. So, if there was water on the Earth 4.4 billion years ago, could there have been life? Could you trace your family back 100 million generations to find your ancestor living billions of years ago? Well, it is possible, but unsurprisingly, hard evidence is very difficult to come by. But in 2017, researchers from University College London reported that they believed they had found it. In their study, they collected samples of rock from the Nouveau-Agitic Belt, located in Hudson Bay in Canada. The rocks here are thought to be between 3.75 and 4.29 billion years old, so the research team had decided it was a logical place to look for evidence of the very first life on Earth. And what they found were traces of life in what appeared to be the remains of an ancient hydrothermal vent. Today, hydrothermal vents are like oases in the desert of the deep sea, sustaining all kinds of life in extreme conditions. Footage captured by remote-operated submersibles shows an almost alien landscape. Giant chimneys rising up from the clean floor that are covered in fish, crustaceans, worms, snails, and cephalopods. And so although living on a crack in the ocean floor might seem extreme to us, it could have been the perfect place for early life to first appear. The team from University College London, led by PhD candidate Matthew Dodd, found that the rocks from Hudson Bay contained microscopic filaments made of iron oxide. Bacterial colonies around deep-sea hydrothermal vents today form similar structures, which suggested that early life could have existed on these ancient rocks. In addition, the filaments contained carbon isotopes that are diagnostic of biological processes. And so perhaps 4.29 billion years ago, you were a microbe living on a hydrothermal vent. Of course, life at this time was nothing like the plants or animals we know today. Instead, there were only microscopic, single-celled organisms that thrived in the extreme environment of the deep sea. And these tiny ancestors didn't rely on sunlight for energy. Instead, they harnessed the chemical reactions going on inside the vent. Seawater interacting with superheated rocks of up to 400 degrees Celsius in the Earth's mantle shot out energy-rich minerals and gases like iron and hydrogen sulfide, providing excellent conditions for chemosynthesis, the process by which microorganisms use chemical reactions between organic molecules rather than sunlight to produce organic compounds. And so we have a fairly good idea where life began, but what do we know about how it began? There was, of course, a time before life, a time before both the chicken and the egg. Life, therefore, must have started somewhere, not with a cell, but with a chemical reaction. In the dark, mineral-rich depths of the southwest Indian Ridge, scientists from the Chinese Academy of Sciences have uncovered solid evidence that the stage for life may have been set by simple rocks and water. Their recent studies have revealed mysterious carbon-rich material trapped within oceanic crust basalts, a type of matter key for life. Yet these carbon compounds are truly non-biological, non-living, and sculpted by the raw energy of geochemical processes. And so how does this lifeless rock give rise to the building blocks of life? The Chinese team combined cutting-edge microscopy and computer simulations to show that hydrogen gas, bubbling out of deep-sea hydrothermal vents, interacts with a material called goethite. It uses it almost like a mineral workbench. In this process, carbon dioxide, dissolved in seawater, transforms into larger, more organic molecules. Each time a small carbon-based molecule joins another, a more complex compound is born, gradually inching closer to life as we know it. So according to this groundbreaking research, minerals like goethite could have acted like catalysts for simple molecules to combine and grow. Over countless years, this organic condensation might have laid the foundations for amino acids and fatty acids, essential ingredients for life, to appear. However, this is just one idea. There are other options on the table. Another compelling theory is known as the membrane-first hypothesis. Every living cell, from the bacteria in your gut to the neurons in your brain, has one thing in common. It is separated from the outside world by a barrier. This barrier is called a membrane. The membrane-first hypothesis suggests that before there were genes, proteins, or any of the molecular machinery we associate with life today, there were membranes. These would have been simple, bubble-like structures floating around in the primordial ocean. But how could a bubble be the first step towards life? Well, these early membranes were selective. Small molecules slipped through easily, but larger, more complex molecules got trapped inside. That meant that if, by chance, some useful chemical reaction started happening inside, that reaction would be protected and concentrated within the bubble. Without that boundary, any useful molecules could drift away, but inside they are forced together, and the chances of something new happening are increased. Both organic condensation and membrane first are compelling options for the origin of life. But there is another contender, and one that many scientists think has the strongest evidence behind it. The year is 1962, and Alexander Rich, a biophysicist at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, is puzzling over how life began. The conventional wisdom of the time was that proteins must have come first, but Rich is not so sure. Proteins need instructions to be built, and those instructions are stored in DNA. But of course, DNA itself is useless without proteins to copy and read it. Rich, however, has been studying polynucleotides, or RNA chains, and he has noticed something. Unlike proteins, polynucleotides have a specific arrangement that could allow them to catalyze their own reproduction. In other words, a strand of RNA could facilitate the formation of matching strands, creating double-stranded molecules. RNA could copy itself. Alexander Rich was the first scientist to explicitly propose that life could have started with RNA-like molecules, rather than proteins or DNA. A simpler RNA world dwelling in the deep ocean billions of years ago, before DNA and proteins became more dominant. And so, we have traced life back to its very earliest moments on Earth, and been provided with differing theories. But whether it was in the form of organic condensation, RNA molecules, or lipid bubbles, we still haven't answered a fundamental question. What actually is life? It might sound like a simple question, but defining life can be surprisingly difficult. Is a virus alive? It can reproduce, just like we can, but only by hijacking other cells. And what about those self-replicating RNA molecules? Are they alive? They copy themselves and evolve, but at their core they are just chemicals floating around in water. This is where things get tricky, so scientists have proposed various different definitions for sorting life from non-life. Some say that life must be able to reproduce, metabolize, and respond to its environment. Others argue that life is anything capable of evolution through natural selection. But every definition has exceptions and grey areas, such as viruses being capable of evolution and reproduction, yet not being classed as life. And so perhaps the line between life and non-life isn't quite as sharp as we would like to think. Maybe in those early oceans, there was a spectrum from simple chemicals to self-replicating molecules to primitive cells. Each step would have blurred the boundary a little more, meaning that maybe the question, what is life, doesn't have a black or white answer. But what we can say for certainty is this. Once life emerged, however we choose to define it, it didn't stay simple for long. Of course, life has come a very long way since the early days of our planet. Today, billions of animals, plants, fungi, bacteria, and archaea inhabit all corners of the Earth. And so, how did this happen? How did the Earth go from a desolate planet, populated only by simple microbes, to one teeming with life. To begin with, all living organisms were unicellular, made up of a single cell. Unicellular organisms are usually microscopic, and each cell has to do everything necessary for its survival on its own, like converting external elements into energy and reproducing by self-replication. Even when individual cells form colonies, such as bacterial mats, they don't have different functions. Each cell is solely responsible for itself. Multicellular organisms, however, are made up of multiple cells, all of which rely on each other for survival. Cells can protect each other from attack by viruses or harmful bacteria, and even when individual cells die, the organism as a whole can go on living. While the transition from single-celled organisms to true multicellular life may seem like a colossal undertaking, there is evidence to suggest that even simple unicellular organisms had most of the genes necessary for evolving multicellularity. Nicole King, a researcher at the University of California at Berkeley, studied a group of simple organisms called choanoflagellates. They are single-celled, but are considered to be closely related to animals and are capable of some things that are usually unique to multicellular life, like sexual reproduction. Choanoflagellates also form colonies, much like our unicellular ancestors are thought to have done. It's hard to say exactly when this may have happened, but it is thought that between 3 and 3.5 billion years ago, some single-celled organisms may have grouped together and coordinated their behavior. After many years of study, King and her lab team had discovered 350 kinds of genes in the choanoflagellates that usually only turn up in complex animals. They found genes that help control the functions of specialized cells, cell growth regulators, and even genes that help cells stick together, which are used in modern animals for keeping muscles intact. And so King and her colleagues believe that choanoflagellates could be similar to the unicellular ancestor of animals, and that such organisms were already genetically equipped for evolving into multicellular life. The evolution of multicellular life, therefore, may have been a series of incremental steps, rather than one sudden leap. Of course, multicellular organisms are much more complex than single-celled life. When multiple cells make up one organism, individual cells perform different functions. Modern animals have an impressive diversity of cell types. For example, humans have as many as 200 kinds, such as nerve cells, skin cells, and muscle cells. By comparison, plants, fungi, and algae have fewer cell types, but are still classed as examples of complex multicellular organisms. This complexity, particularly in animals, brought about several advantages over time. Although the first animals were stationary and didn't look too different to plants, they eventually became mobile, which allowed them to move to different areas in search of food and mates. And pretty soon, life was about to do so much more. In 1996, a rural farmer from Liaoning province discovered a new species of dinosaur. The fossil was preserved across 2 slabs of siltstone, offering alternate views of the dinosaur encased within. In life, it would have been a small theropod, weighing no more than 1 kilogram, but the most intriguing thing about it was its extraordinary preservation. Not only was virtually every bone present in the fossil, but so were the impressions of the animal's internal organs and its feathers. This newly discovered dinosaur was named Sinosauropteryx, and although it had feathers, it wasn't a bird, nor was it closely related to them. For feathers, despite being classically associated with birds, predate the avian lineage, extending far back into the Triassic, around 230 to 250 million years ago. Birds are avian dinosaurs that use their feathers to fly, but Sinosauropteryx and other non-avian dinosaurs likely use their feathers for something different. Their feathers wouldn't have been strong enough for powered flight, and so perhaps they were purely for keeping warm. Paleontologists have even discovered evidence of feathers in pterosaur fossils, but they were concentrated around the torso, rather than on their wings, suggesting that the first feathers evolved for insulation, an ancestral trait shared by both dinosaurs and pterosaurs. And so it might be surprising when the features we are familiar with did not evolve for their current purpose. But this is actually the most common way new adaptations evolve in nature. They begin as an adaptation to a specific ecological challenge, and over time prove useful for other things. And such evolutionary developments probably took place even in our earliest ancestors. Around 600 million years ago, some 4 billion years after the formation of the Earth, life began to change. Prior to this point in time, there were no macroscopic multicellular organisms. Fossil organisms were much too tiny to be seen without a microscope, and the only macroscopic fossils known to science were from life forms that formed colonies, like the 3.5 billion-year-old stromatolites from Western Australia. Indeed, for a long time after the earliest organic microbes on Earth evolved, and multicellular organisms first appeared, life didn't change much. Indeed, this was one of the reasons that scientists coined the term the boring billion for the period between 1.8 billion and 800 million years ago. From a geological and biological perspective, the boring billion was characterized by relative tectonic stability, climate stasis, and painfully slow evolutionary change. But then, something happened. Sometime between 800 and 650 million years ago, it is believed that extreme global cooling created a period known as the cryogenian glaciation, or snowball Earth, in which almost all of the planet's surface became frozen. Of course, it's hard to imagine how life could have withstood such conditions, but instead of being driven to extinction after the glaciation, life forms suddenly got a lot bigger and more complex. This was during a time that we now know as the Ediacaran. Life was still very different to what we are now familiar with, but it was beginning to sort itself into some of the basic categories that we use today. Some Ediacaran organisms, such as the slug-like Kimberella and Sprigina, are thought to have been the precursors to animals, while the possible ancestors of plants and fungi have been linked to microfossils found in China. Other genera, like Charnia and Fractophusus, superficially resemble plants, but were probably more closely related to animals. Indeed, the vast majority of life during the Ediacaran was sessile, meaning it was unable to move on its own. Ediacaran life generally survived by anchoring itself to something else, such as rocks or oceanic substrate, similar to modern-day Hydra. This, and the leaf-like shape of many genera, gives the illusion that Ediacaran organisms were plants, but it is generally thought that macroscopic animals were the first to evolve and plants would come later. So, although macroscopic, complex life had finally arrived on the scene, the Ediacaran oceans were quiet, subdued places. But soon, an explosion of diversity would occur. Dinever Castle is located on what is now the western edge of the Brecon Beacons National Park in South Wales. It was built in the 12th century atop a hill overlooking the River Towy and looms above it shrouded in trees. When it was first constructed, it was an important strategic fortress for Welsh kings. But by the 17th century, the once great castle had been converted into a kind of summer house by the English lords who now owned the land. And so on a warm, sunny day in 1688, 28-year-old scientist Edward Lloyd would have been able to walk the grounds and muse upon the long history of the place in relative peace. The sieges and battles that the ancient stone walls must have borne witness to, long settled. Although it wasn't really the castle that Lloyd was there for, he was interested in something much older: fossils. Since beginning working at the recently opened Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, Lloyd had been travelling all over Wales, mainly to document local flora, but also on a personal quest to find evidence of ancient life in the mountainous landscape. And after exploring the grounds of the castle for a short while, he eventually found what he was looking for. The impression of an animal, preserved in stone, but unlike anything he'd ever seen before. Lloyd sat down in the grass and sketched the fossil, thinking to himself that it looked like the skeleton of a large, flat fish. He eventually would go on to publish a description of the fossil in the Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society, but it would not be until over 100 years later that Lloyd's discovery would be recognised for what it really was: a trilobite. Lloyd couldn't have known it in 1688, but he had just recorded the first known evidence of a life form from the Cambrian explosion. Trilobites appear in the fossil record some 521 million years ago and are some of the most common fossils that have been found in Wales. In fact, trilobites were so numerous in the Cambrian, they've almost become emblematic of the period. The name Cambrian actually comes from Cambria, the Roman name for Wales. Trilobites were among the first animals to develop complex, jointed exoskeletons, and they had compound eyes, made of hundreds or thousands of tiny, independent light-sensing units called ommatidia. They had as many as 15 pairs of legs and gills on their thighs. Trilobites became uniquely successful organisms, roaming the ancient seas for over 250 million years, and were some of the most numerous animals that lived in the Cambrian seas. The Cambrian was the period of time that followed directly on from the Ediacaran. Beginning around 540 million years ago, its early days were characterized by the sudden diversification of life on Earth. Not only did trilobites appear during this time, so did other arthropods, like the predatory Anomalocaris, the bizarre Opabinia, and the spiky Hallucigenia. Aside from arthropods, there were also mollusks, worms, cnidarians, and even the earliest chordates. For the first time in Earth's history, life was truly complex. Animals could move on their own, they had eyes and mouths, and predator-prey dynamics evolved. But what was our ancestor during this remarkable time? Scientists believe that during the Cambrian, over 500 million years ago, you were one of the earliest chordates. But what is a chordate? And which one? It's hard to pin down exactly, as we're dealing with incredibly old material, so DNA analysis is impossible, but there are some candidates that are more likely than others. The first is a creature called Hycoichthys, which lived 518 million years ago in the latter stages of the early Cambrian. It was originally found in Yunnan province, southern China, and resembles a small, simple fish. About 2.5 centimeters long, it was roughly the same size as the tip of your little finger, and had a defined skull, which was rare for animals of the time. The second is Picaia gracilens, an animal that looked like a modern sea slug. Picaia dates to the Middle Cambrian, some 508 million years ago, and ranged from 1.5 to 6 centimeters in length. Although these two animals look quite different, they both had a few important features in common as chordates, and perhaps most importantly, something called a notochord. This is a flexible, rod-like structure that runs along the length of the body, and its evolution is important because it served as a precursor to the vertebral column in later chordates. In other words, it was a very early backbone. In Hycoichthys and Picaia, the notochord provided structural support, giving their muscles something to anchor to, which was essential for more efficient swimming. And the notochord wasn't the only important feature shared by these two early chordates. Both Hycoichthys and Picaia had segmented muscles, which allowed them to undulate their bodies in a controlled, wave-like motion. This style of movement is similar to the motion seen in modern fish, highlighting an evolutionary step towards more efficient propulsion through the water. Another key feature was the presence of pharyngeal slits. These were openings along the throat that were probably used for filtering out food particles from the water, but they would eventually evolve into gills, and also jaws. Together, these shared features mark Hycoichthys and Picaia as key figures in the story of our evolutionary history. Although they were both small and unassuming, even by Cambrian standards, they represent some of the first steps towards the development of true vertebrates. which includes everything from sharks to frogs, snakes to birds, cats to whales, and humans. But why did these little Cambrian animals evolve notochords in the first place? Evidence suggests that, like feathers, the original purpose of a notochord could have been quite different to what it would be eventually used for. In basal chordates, like Hycoichthys and Picaia, the notochord is located close to the gut tube, which has led some to suggest that it originally evolved from a digestive structure and could have been used for transporting nutrients throughout the body. Others think that the notochord may have developed from a structure found in some soft-bodied animals, like worms. A study published in the journal Science found that annelid worms have a muscle that runs along the dorsal or back side of their bodies, similar to how notochords and then vertebrae run along the back of chordates. This muscle has been called an axochord, and it's assumed that it helps worms to get around. Earthworms, for example, require a lot of strength to burrow through soil, so axochords could help them do this. Perhaps protochordates behaved in a similar way, burrowing into ocean substrates to avoid predators like Anomala Carys. It therefore seems possible that annelids and chordates share a common ancestor, and that the basic structure of a notochord was already present before the evolution of Hycoichthys and Picaia. It just developed over time to suit the challenges of their environments. And so, whatever its original purpose may have been, in Hycoichthys and Picaia, the notochord became crucial for efficient movement through the water. Notochords allowed for undulatory swimming, which would have made basal chordates quicker and more maneuverable than animals like arthropods, which are limited by their hard exoskeletons. In an environment as rapidly diversifying as the Cambrian seas, competition for resources and space must have been intense, and notochords could have given our little ancestors the advantage they needed to survive. Notochords even paved the way for the evolution of other bones, which helped later chordates maintain the shape of their bodies and protect their vital organs. And indeed, within a few 100 million years, they would help support animals as they made their way into a new frontier, out of the water and onto the land. Just how closely related are you to a bat? Bats are mammals. They grow hair on their bodies and give birth to live young. They are social animals. But that is where the similarities seem to end. We humans rely on our legs to get around, whereas bats have wings. Humans primarily use sight and touch to interact with the world around us, but bats use echolocation, super-sensitive hearing that allows them to navigate and hunt even in total darkness. But even with these differences, we do share a surprisingly close evolutionary relationship. Indeed, if we trace our two lineages back through time, we find a common ancestor with bats that lived during the late Cretaceous. But what if we push the hands on the evolutionary clock back even further? How related are we to a lizard or a frog? Well, if we go back 5 times deeper into the past, to around 400 million years ago, we would find a common ancestor that unites all terrestrial vertebrates, from amphibians to reptiles, from birds to mammals. Imagine yourself standing in the floodplains of the Gambia in Western Africa. You look out over the river, a waterway that flows so slowly local people swear it sometimes runs backwards. You might be surprised to find out that these swampy floodplains are the perfect place to find a relic from our evolutionary past. For during the dry season, when shallow pools along the floodplain begin to evaporate, a curious animal can be seen crawling through the mud. It is a lungfish. Broadly eel-like in shape, this fish is equipped with a thick tail and fins that function like rudimentary limbs, allowing it to drag itself from one pool to another. Indeed, the lungfish is one of only a couple of kinds of lobe-finned fish left in the world. And they may appear archaic compared with modern ray-finned fish, but we can learn a lot from them, because lungfish, as their name suggests, have a pair of lungs, allowing them to breathe while on land. Today, it is one of the only fish in the world that does this, but this kind of adaptation may not have been quite so rare 400 million years ago, in a time known as the Devonian. And in fact, lungfish themselves are truly ancient, and are thought to have first evolved during this time. The Devonian spanned 60 million years, from 419 to 359 million years ago, and is known as the Age of Fish, a period of time when fish became the most dominant species on the planet. They were diverse, widespread, and grew larger than any other animals before them. The Devonian oceans were filled with a huge variety, not just of lobe-finned, but also heavily armoured placoderms, primitive ray-finned fish, and even the ancestors of sharks and rays. And yet despite this dominance of fish, this was also a time that has come to be associated with the first land animals. Up until this point, the majority of life had been concentrated in the seas, with only a few hardy arthropods braving the barren surface. However, by the Devonian, plants and fungi had already begun their colonization of the land. These pioneer plants, such as lycophytes, ferns and horsetails, and bizarre fungi like the towering Prototaxites, measuring up to 30 feet tall, helped to create soil for more varieties of plants and fungi to grow in. Soon there were primitive trees like Watiesa and Archaeopteris, and the spread of these first forests created new habitats for animals on land, including the earliest tetrapods. Tetrapods are a class of animals united by one key feature: 4 limbs. It includes a vast and diverse array of species. In fact, if you were to be asked to name 5 kinds of animals off the top of your head, the majority of them would probably be tetrapods. Indeed, as tetrapods ourselves, they're the kinds of animals we encounter most often. In our daily lives, we see animals like dogs, cats, squirrels and pigeons, and farm animals like cows, sheep, chicken and pigs. These are all tetrapods, and although we look very different, we all share an ancient common ancestor, an ancestral tetrapod that can be traced back to the Devonian. And so how did we go from a world ruled from the oceans by fish to one where 4-limbed animals dominated the land? In 2008, paleontologist Neil Shubin published his book, Your Inner Fish, after his scientific team discovered a fossil that could answer that question. The book introduced Tiktaalik rosei, an ancient creature from the late Devonian some 375 million years ago. When first looking at the fossil, which was recovered from Ellesmere Island in the Canadian Arctic, it can be difficult to say exactly what kind of animal Tiktaalik was. Was it a fish, a large amphibian, or even some kind of reptile? A closer inspection, however, reveals several distinctive fish traits, such as gill arches and bony scales. So, was it a fish? Technically, yes. But Tiktaalik also had a suite of features that betrayed its evolutionary trajectory towards life on land. For beneath its overlapping scales, it had bones that closely resemble those found in tetrapods. Within its front fins, for example, were primitive versions of the humerus, radius and ulna, which in humans form the upper arm and forearm. These bones were hidden within Tiktaalik's fins, but were arranged in a way that allowed for a degree of flexibility and strength. For instance, Tiktaalik may have had something akin to a wrist, which would have allowed it to prop itself up and crawl around in muddy shallows and even onto land for a short time. Tiktaalik also had a much more robust ribcage than any other fish, which would have supported its body weight while on land. Shubin and his team had been searching for this kind of fossil animal for a long time, because although it had been suspected that tetrapods must have evolved from fish, there were no transitional fossils to prove how fins gradually developed into limbs. These transitional animals, that fall somewhere between a fish and a tetrapod, have since come to be known informally as fishopods. Without access to a time machine, we can only ever guess at the way fishopods like Tiktaalik might have behaved. but it seems likely, given their physical adaptations, that they were ambush predators. Like modern crocodilians, fishopods would probably lie in wait in the murky shallows before lunging at smaller fish or invertebrates. Their powerful pectoral fins and flexible necks allowed them to strike with precision, a feature uncommon in fish, but vital for life on land. And fishopods were far from the only predators of the Devonian. Massive hunters like the 4-meter-long Dunkleosteus and even Eurypterid sea scorpions lurked beneath the surface. So it seems likely that our fishopod ancestors might also have put their sturdy fins to use in evading such monsters, hauling themselves out of the water and onto the relative safety of the land. And so, in the Devonian 375 million years ago, you were a transitional creature. Although you were a fish, you had features in common with future tetrapods, which your lineage would give rise to. You had muscular fins, a flexible neck that allowed you to scan your environment and catch prey more efficiently, and strong ribs that supported your weight during your forays onto land. So we know how tetrapods and the earliest limbs gradually evolved from a lineage of lobe-finned fish, but how did these pioneering animals develop the ability to breathe on land? All fish, including ancient fishopods, have gills. These allow them to filter oxygen from the water, but obviously not from the air. Tetrapods, on the other hand, have lungs, which do the opposite of gills. We can breathe in the air, but will drown after just a few minutes underwater. So where did our lungs come from? The answer to that question lies within the lungfish. Despite their name, lungfish also have gills. This combination of gills and lungs allows them to survive both in the water and on land. However, soft tissues do not preserve well in the fossil record, making it more or less impossible to say for sure whether our fishopod ancestors also had them. But, luckily, lungfish are not alone, for there are other ancient monsters that have survived until our time that may offer some clues. It is a breezy summer afternoon in 1938, and a fishing boat is trundling through the water near the mouth of the Chalumna River in South Africa. She is a trawler, so her crew is used to pulling up all kinds of strange-looking bottom dwellers from the sea floor. But nothing could have prepared them for the creature they caught in their nets that day. It was huge, about 1.5 meters long, with a vivid steel-blue body dappled in pale, milky white spots that contrasted with the more familiar catches of the day. Its scales were thick and armor-like, rough to the touch, and its head was covered in bony plates. And even more startling were the fish's fleshy, almost limb-like fins that projected from its body like arms and legs. The captain of the trawler quickly called a local museum curator to come and investigate. Marjorie Courtney Latimer, who worked at the Museum of East London, had no idea what the primordial-looking fish was, but she immediately took it back to the museum to be preserved and studied. She then contacted J.L.B. Smith, an ichthyologist at Rhodes University, who was stunned by what she showed him. The specimen looked exactly like fossils of an ancient kind of fish known as a coelacanth. But coelacanths had gone extinct 66 million years ago. And so how could one have been alive and swimming around in the West Indian Ocean just a day before? This was one of the greatest zoological surprises of the 20th century. Against all expectations, the coelacanth turned out to have survived the extinction that wiped out the dinosaurs and had been living in the depths of the ocean all this time. These primitive-looking fish have been called living fossils, because their appearance has changed very little since they first showed up in the fossil record 410 million years ago during the early Devonian. There are only a few other examples of living fossils known to science, including the horseshoe crab, which first appeared over 250 million years ago and has remained fundamentally the same ever since. The ginkgo biloba tree is another example, dating back over 200 million years, but no other living fossil holds quite the same ancient pedigree as the coelacanth. Indeed, most of the other living fossils have their origins in the Permian or Mesozoic eras, whereas coelacanth ancestors were swimming through Earth's oceans before the first land plants had evolved to form forests, and before vertebrates had ventured out of the water. Based on their fossils, scientists in the 1930s already knew quite a lot about coelacanths, and had long suspected that they might have lungs, just like their lungfish relatives. But it was very difficult to prove without access to live specimens. Even now that we know coelacanths aren't extinct, they are notoriously difficult to study. They live in the deep sea, in small, isolated populations that inhabit underwater caves and rocky outcrops, so it's hard to get to them without specialized diving equipment. But in 2015, a team led by researchers from the University of Rio de Janeiro got their hands on a few preserved coelacanths from museum stores and performed dissections on them. And what they discovered was both a vindication and a surprise. For rather than a pair of functional lungs, the coelacanths had just one vestigial lung. This suggested that ancient coelacanths also had at least one lung, but as their descendants adapted to spend more time at greater depths, they stopped being useful and became vestigial. Even though it is vestigial, the presence of a lung in coelacanths led to an important conclusion. Since coelacanths and lungfish both come from ancient lineages of lobe-finned fish that originated in the early Devonian, and both have lungs, that means lungs are actually an ancestral trait. An ancestral trait is an anatomical feature that is shared among related taxa and are inherited from a common ancestor. For example, taillessness is an ancestral trait in humans and apes. No living ape has a tail, and neither do fossil apes, which tells us that our common ancestor likely also didn't have a tail. And so when it comes to lungs, their presence in both kinds of living lobe-finned fish means that the last common ancestor of all lobe-finned fish, and therefore all tetrapods, also had lungs. Lungs are a lot older than you might have thought. But does this necessarily mean that lobe-finned fish have always been able to breathe air, just as modern lungfish do? Probably not. If you consider what land was like back in the early Devonian, practically devoid of all life, it makes no sense for these fish to have evolved the ability to breathe out of the water. Instead, just as our backbones may have evolved for a different reason to that which they have today, it seems likely that lungs too originally held a different purpose. And scientists think that an organ found in modern-day fish could hold the key to this mystery. All ray-finned fish, from salmon to sardines, have something called a swim bladder, which helps them stay buoyant in the water. Sharks, rays, and other fish don't have swim bladders, which means they always have to keep moving or they end up sinking to the bottom. It's thought that since ray-finned and lobe-finned fish share a common ancestor, swim bladders, or something like them, could be an ancestral trait, but instead of being used for buoyancy in lobe-finned genera, they eventually evolved into functional lungs. These new air-breathing organs would have helped them venture above the water's surface as plants spread across the land and new terrestrial habitats became available. And this meant that our fishapod ancestors in the late Devonian didn't have to come up with a brand new solution when it came to adapting to a semi-terrestrial lifestyle. They already had the perfect hardware for the job. Evolution just had to fine-tune it. But what species was this Devonian ancestor? Which species in particular do we have to thank for the development of our limbs, ribs, and lungs? Once again, we're dealing with incredibly vast timescales, so it's difficult to be sure, but one of the earliest genera to exhibit a combination of fish and tetrapod traits was Eusthenopteron, which lived around 385 million years ago, 10 million before Tiktaalik. Eusthenopteron lacked the strong, flexible, wrist-like structure of later fishapods, although it may have had some degree of strength and mobility in its fins, potentially allowing it to push itself along the bottom of shallow waters. But these fins were not yet strong enough to support Eusthenopteron's weight on land, and it didn't have a strong ribcage like Tiktaalik, but it clearly provided an important foundation for the gradual evolution of load-bearing limbs. And so, lobe-finned fish and early tetrapods gave us a lot of the features that today we take for granted. Indeed, in many ways, we still resemble our lobe-finned ancestors. We retain the basic body structure that evolved over 400 million years ago in the Devonian. We have 4 limbs, which evolved from 4 lobed fins, flexible and supportive wrists and ankles, a set of digits at the end of each hand and foot, a distinct head, a strong skeleton made of bone, and a pair of lungs to let us breathe the air. But of course, that would be far from the end of our adaptations to new environments. The young Mary Anning lived so close to the sea that storms could flood her house. Her father took her and her brother Joseph fossil hunting, and this lit her curiosity. At the age of 12, she discovered the first ichthyosaur skeleton, becoming known as the Princess of Paleontology. Sparking curiosity at an early age can make such a difference in a child's life, and nurturing that spark is exactly what KiwiCo aims to do. KiwiCo offers fun, hands-on STEM projects that inspire the next generation of scientists, engineers, and creators. History of Humankind's co-founder and his family had a great time with their crate from KiwiCo's Kiwi Crate line, and in their most recent crate, they got to become paleontologists. They got to dig for fossils, build a T-Rex skeleton, and even make casts of other dinosaurs. Indeed, we especially love that KiwiCo has different crate lines for every age and interest, from baby sensory play in the Panda Crate, to art and design with the Doodle Crate, to full-on engineering projects in the Eureka Crate for teens and adults. There truly is something for everyone. Each crate for ages 3 and up arrives monthly, filled with everything you need for a project that blends creativity, problem solving, and fun. Plus, it makes a fantastic holiday gift. Instead of just another toy, you're giving something that kids can actually build and be proud of. So, to share this great gift with the children in your life, use my code HUMANKIND to get 50% off your first monthly crate for kids aged 3 and over, or go to kiwico.com/humankind. In the southern United States, there is an entire species of lizard that is female. The New Mexico whiptail arose from the crossbreeding of 2 other whiptail species, a hybridization that appears to have prevented males from forming. Although these all-female populations still engage in mating behavior, which some researchers believe is necessary to stimulate and trigger ovulation. A single female lizard will then lay a clutch of eggs, each one hatching into offspring that is a genetic clone of the mother. It is one rather unique example of continuing the survival of a species through reproduction. All life on Earth reproduces. It's one of the core features that classifies something as being a life form. If a species can't replicate itself and pass on its genes to the next generation, then it is not living. Even the most simple unicellular organisms reproduce to pass on their DNA. DNA, or deoxyribonucleic acid, is the long molecule that contains the genetic instructions used in the growth and reproduction of all organisms. This structure consists of 2 long chains of nucleotides twisted into a double helix. Each nucleotide is made up of a sugar, a phosphate group, and one of 4 nitrogenous bases: adenine, thymine, cytosine, and guanine. And the sequence of these bases forms a code that directs cellular processes and inheritance. Of course, from an evolutionary perspective, the structure of DNA is hugely important. It allows for accurate replication during cell division, ensuring that genetic information is passed from one generation to the next. The double helix structure helps this process by unwinding and splitting into 2 strands, each serving as a template to create a copy, and this precise copying is essential for heredity, as it ensures that offspring inherit genetic traits from their parents, maintaining the continuity of their species. This genetic information can be passed down through either quick and efficient asexual reproduction, as used by bacteria and in some very rare cases, animals, like the New Mexico whiptails, or through another method, that introduces genetic diversity, sexual reproduction. Over hundreds of millions of years of evolution, life has developed myriad ways of sexual reproduction. One of the earliest to evolve was external fertilization, which is still used by many living fish and amphibians. It's a pretty straightforward process in which the females release their eggs into the water and the males fertilize them. Since the earliest tetrapods were very closely related to fish, it's safe to assume that they too used external fertilization to reproduce, but at some point in the long evolutionary history of reptiles, mammals and birds, another method evolved: internal fertilization. This kind of fertilization happens inside the body of the female, and it gives the developing offspring a better chance of survival than external fertilization does. But despite this, early reptiles and mammals, despite evolving internal fertilization to better protect their developing offspring, probably wouldn't have made great parents. In fact, many living reptiles do not offer their offspring any parental care. Sea turtles, for example, lay hundreds of eggs, but other than burying them in the sand to hide them from potential predators, the females do very little to look after their babies, and the males do nothing at all. This might sound heartless, but it's a strategy that works, and has done for hundreds of millions of years. Rather than caring for their offspring to ensure their survival, turtles lay large clutches of eggs because it's statistically probable that at least some of them will survive. If a sea turtle lays 100 eggs, even if half of them are eaten by predators, 50 of her babies will still have a chance of making it to adulthood and producing their own offspring. The sea turtle has ensured that her genes are passed on, so in her instinctual mind, her job is done. But if this strategy works, and it clearly does because turtles have been around for 230 million years, why did our ancestors evolve to invest so much time and energy in their offspring? To answer this question, we will need to go back to the Jurassic. It is 170 million years ago. The world and its inhabitants have changed drastically since the evolution of the earliest life forms. It might have taken billions of years for organisms with shells, bones and lungs to appear, but in just a few 100 million years since then, life has been thriving. Pangaea, the great supercontinent that once incorporated all of Earth's landmasses, has already started to break apart. There are now two separate landmasses, Laurasia in the north and Gondwana in the south. Pole to pole is covered in lush forests, leading to a great diversity of animal life. Indeed, the Jurassic is home to true giants. Long-necked sauropods like Shunosaurus and Cetiosaurus browse the leaves of towering trees, while predatory theropods like Megalosaurus stalk from the shadows. There are leviathans in the seas too, Leopleurodon with teeth like hunting knives, and Ophthalmosaurus whose eyes were bigger than dinner plates. But far from the notice of all of these giant reptiles, a quiet revolution is taking place. In a burrow, several feet below ground, an egg is hatching. It is tiny, only a few centimeters in diameter, and from inside comes an equally tiny baby. She and her siblings are born blind, and instinct tells them what to do. In the darkness of the burrow, they crawl towards their mother, nestling into her warm fur and drinking her milk. This little family belongs to a species called Morganucodon watsoni, egg-laying mammals from the late Triassic and early Jurassic. The mother Morganucodon will care for her babies for many months, feeding them and providing them with warmth and protection in the safety of the burrow, until they grow strong enough to venture up to the world above. There, she will teach them everything they need to know about surviving in the Jurassic. And eventually, they will leave their mother to go in search of mates and raise offspring of their own, so the cycle can begin again. Such devotion to a small number of helpless offspring is a very risky reproductive strategy. Indeed, if something goes wrong and the offspring die, then the parents have wasted their time and effort and will need to start all over again. However, if the offspring survive to adulthood and manage to reproduce, then the parents can ensure their DNA is passed on not just through one, but at least 2 generations. And so in this case, survival of the fittest doesn't mean that only the strong survive. It means that certain adaptive traits, like having a driving instinct to care for offspring, can help certain individuals survive long enough to breed and pass on those traits. And gradually, through evolutionary adaptation, caring for offspring becomes more and more advanced, leading to animals like humans, elephants, or killer whales, who care for their offspring for many years and often maintain close bonds for their whole lives. But that wasn't the end, for by the late Jurassic, evolution had driven the appearance of a new reproductive strategy, one that is used by thousands of species today, and one that was recently discovered millions of years further into the past than previously known. In 2011, a team of Chinese researchers, led by Professor Liu Jieshi, discovered a small and exceptionally well-preserved skeleton in the Qiaojishan Formation of Liaoning Province, northeastern China. Liaoning is an area famous for its Mesozoic mammal fossils, and Professor Liu and his colleagues had already made a few important Jurassic discoveries there, including a paperclip-sized mammal whose skull helped us investigate the evolution of the ear, and a beaver-like, swimming mammal that showed early mammals were far more ecologically diverse than previously thought. And so once again, Liaoning would reveal more about our early mammalian relatives. They had discovered Juramaia, meaning, of course, Jurassic Mother, who lived 160 million years ago, and rather than laying eggs like Morganucodon, she gave birth to live young. For Juramaia, there were several adaptive advantages to this new trait. Unlike her ancestors, she carried her babies inside her body, freeing her from the obligation of guarding a clutch of eggs. Juramaia could also run away from danger without having to abandon her nest, and as long as she protected herself, she also protected her offspring. And since her babies grew inside of her, they could develop for longer and be born more prepared for the world. Today, 94% of mammals are eutherian. What started as a novel adaptation in Jurassic species like Juramaia quickly spread and became dominant. Juramaia's unique ability to gestate young inside the body and give birth to developed offspring gave it a clear advantage, and it was able to breed and raise its young more successfully than its competitors. Juramaia passed on this novel adaptation in its genes, and we, and all other eutherian mammals, carry on that legacy in our DNA. And so, 160 million years ago, all the way back in the Jurassic, you were an early eutherian mammal. You were born not from an egg, but directly from your mother's body. Even though evolution had been relatively slow for mammals during the Mesozoic, compared to the domineering dinosaurs, these new methods of reproduction gradually gave them the edge they needed to excel in a variety of environments. Indeed, by the time of the Cretaceous, 145 to 66 million years ago, eutherian mammals had already branched into all kinds of niches. Eomaia was a tree climber, feeding primarily on insects, but there was also Protungulatum, which was relatively large for an early mammal, and Leptictidium, whose short forelimbs and long back legs suggests a bipedal, kangaroo-like way of getting around. Although still, most eutherian mammals in the Cretaceous period were small and fed primarily on insects. Dinosaurs, pterosaurs, and marine reptiles occupied the other niches. They were the predators, the big grazers, the fishers, and the flyers, leaving little room for mammals to branch into those specialities. But of course, all of that was about to change. In 2025, more than half the world's population lives in cities. Megacities like Tokyo, Beijing, and New York are home to tens of millions of people. Skyscrapers rise above streets packed with cars, bikes, and pedestrians, creating landscapes that seem like the exact opposite of the natural environments that came before. But if you stop and think about it, wildlife is everywhere in cities. London, for example, is home to an estimated 3 million pigeons. New York is estimated to be home to 3 million rats, while thousands of coyotes live in cities like Toronto and Los Angeles. These animals are thriving amongst concrete around the world, exploding into urban environments even as we build them. Of course, urban wildlife species did not originally evolve in cities, but a combination of traits made it possible for them to make homes for themselves in them. Most, like coyotes, are highly adaptable animals. Indeed, coyotes are opportunistic and will eat just about anything that they can sink their teeth into. They're even capable of adapting their behavior, learning to navigate traffic, and modifying their activity patterns to avoid conflict with humans. But perhaps the biggest influence which has allowed coyotes to take over so many American cities is a lack of competition with other animals. Out in the plains and woodlands, where they originally evolved, coyotes have to deal with large predators like wolves and mountain lions. But in many cities, they are the top carnivores, and so they thrive in urban environments where food is plentiful and competition is scarce. Animals like coyotes offer us a fascinating glimpse of how a species can adapt relatively quickly to a new environment, especially one in which they have fewer rivals. And the fossil record, and specifically our deep past, is full of examples of similarly ingenious creatures, species that became highly diverse and exploited new worlds. During the Jurassic and Cretaceous, dinosaurs reigned supreme on the land, pterosaurs occupied the skies, and marine reptiles dominated the seas. But in the preceding Triassic, these environments had been ruled by archosaurs, like the Rurasuchians and Etosaurs. It was only with their extinction at the end of the Triassic that dinosaurs, pterosaurs, and marine reptiles were able to take over. They were dominant for 135 million years, through the Jurassic and Cretaceous periods, but eventually they met a similar fate to their archosaur relatives. For 66 million years ago, Armageddon struck. The end Cretaceous mass extinction event wiped out 75% of all species, including all non-avian dinosaurs, pterosaurs, and large marine reptiles. The asteroid that hit the Earth is thought to have been 15 kilometers in diameter and, understandably, severely disrupted the delicate balance of ecosystems. Indeed, it wasn't just these large reptiles that faced extinction. Many plants, insects, fish, amphibians, mammals, and even microorganisms were also driven to extinction, and it would take millions of years for the world to recover. But when it did, the surviving animals, those that had previously been small and unobtrusive to avoid competition with the dinosaurs, suddenly found a world full of opportunities. Extinction is a vital part of life. If we were to witness the scale of the destruction caused by the asteroid impact 66 million years ago, we might find it implausible that the planet could ever recover. However, the Earth has actually been through at least 5 big mass extinction events in its history, and the end Cretaceous event wasn't even the worst of them. At the close of the Triassic, for example, massive volcanic activity in the central magmatic province had caused the extinction of 2/3 of all the world's species. Before this, there was an even worse catastrophe, this too caused by volcanism, 252 million years ago, long before the first dinosaurs walked the Earth. Volcanoes in Siberia wiped out 95% of life on the planet in an event cheerfully known as the Great Dying. And roughly 2 billion years before that, life brought about its own demise. Unicellular creatures started photosynthesizing and suffocated all the other life on the planet with oxygen. But of course, after all of these events, life persisted and came back with a bang. Dinosaurs thrived in the Jurassic, archosaurs rose to prominence after the Great Dying, and photosynthesizing life took control of the globe after the Great Oxidation event. In fact, every time a mass extinction event destroys a huge number of species, it clears the way for other species to diversify and become more numerous. So even if almost all life is driven to extinction, it is always returned, albeit changed. And this is exactly what happened after the end Cretaceous extinction. Unlike in the Jurassic and Cretaceous, when reptiles grew to truly giant sizes, the Cretaceous-Paleogene extinction was a very bad time to be big. Only small animals, those who didn't need much food and could burrow into the earth, survived. Indeed, all large animals over 40 kilograms died out. Large predators during the Cretaceous had occupied different niches to avoid competing with each other. There were predators who specialized in ambushing their prey, like modern crocodiles that stay hidden until the very last moment before they attack. There were also predators who chased their prey, evolving to run exceptionally fast like a cheetah, and there were social predators who relied on teamwork to take down prey. But after the extinction event, these niches would all be left empty, ready to be taken over by whatever came next. By the early Eocene epoch, some 55 million years ago, the Earth had fully recovered from the apocalypse. As in the Cretaceous, temperatures were still warm, and even though habitats had been decimated by the mass extinction, forests had already bounced back, spreading across the globe as they had done before. There were lush green ferns, towering conifers, broad palms, and colourful flowers, just as there had been before the asteroid. But the animal inhabitants of these forests were more familiar to us than they had been in the Cretaceous. For in the place of the dinosaurs and the pterosaurs, the land and skies were now teeming with mammals and birds. Hyracotherium, a diminutive horse ancestor, browsed the low-growing shrubs and ferns, while predatory creodonts watched hungrily from the shadows. Overhead, the first bats took wing, and early songbirds flitted between tree branches, their songs filling the air. And among the highest branches, in a forest of what is now China, there was an animal that would have a big impact on the world to come. It was a primate, and its descendants would one day rise to dominance like no other animal had before. Archicebus, one of the earliest known primates, is hunting. His tiny body, no longer than 20 centimeters from head to tail, clings to a branch with strong fingers. He has large, forward-facing eyes, allowing him to accurately judge distances between tree branches, which he leaps between in search of food. Up here in the dense canopy, Archicebus is protected from large terrestrial predators and has plenty to eat. Fruit, flowers and insects are abundant in the Eocene forests, and primates like Archicebus have evolved to take full advantage. You might not realize it, but primates are an extraordinarily ancient family. Unlike most of the mammalian orders we are familiar with today, such as the carnivorans and rodents, which evolved after the Cretaceous-Paleogene extinction, primates likely had their origins in the Cretaceous, with proto-primates like Purgatorius. Purgatorius, as was the case in many early Eutherian mammals, resembled a shrew, but Archicebus, a true primate that lived 10 million years after, looked very different. But what makes a primate a primate? When Archicebus was discovered in 2003, it was clear from the outset that it was our ancient relative because it possessed a suite of osteological traits that we associate with all living and extinct primates. For instance, Archicebus had grasping hands and feet, with opposable thumbs and big toes, as well as flexible limb joints, both characteristics of a specialized arboreal lifestyle. It also had forward-facing eyes and a shortened snout, suggesting a reduced reliance on smell and an investment in eyesight. Finally, Archicebus had nails instead of claws, which is an adaptation for improving the sensitivity of touch. Of course, many of these are characteristics of humans as well, so it seems we have these early Eocene primates to thank for many of the traits that seem so essential to us today. And yet, Purgatorius lacked many of these traits. Purgatorius had flexible limb joints, but it didn't have opposable thumbs, and its eyes were located on the side of its head. It also retained a relatively long snout, something that was common in early mammals, but is absent in true primates. And so, although there were already proto-primates like Purgatorius living in the Cretaceous, it was only after the Cretaceous-Paleogene extinction event that the primate lineage really began. In a world that had just recovered from an apocalypse, You were an early primate, and you and your kind were flourishing. But what was so special about primates? What niche did we fill? During the Eocene, at the time of our early primate ancestors, some of the top predators were mammals called creodonts. These carnivorous mammals evolved to fill the spaces once held by the theropod dinosaurs. Creodonts were often fast and agile, much like the raptors of the Cretaceous, and they were well adapted to hunting prey that had flourished in the absence of the dinosaurs. Indeed, some creodonts, such as Hyaenodon, had extremely sharp teeth and strong jaws, allowing them to take down much larger animals and crush the bones of their unfortunate victims. While these early mammalian predators might not have been as large as the dinosaurs they replaced, they were no less effective in their role as the top carnivores of their time. Meanwhile, other animals began to evolve to fill the roles of the herbivores. The extinction of mega-herbivores from the Cretaceous created space for the earliest herbivorous mammals to thrive. Primitive ungulates, mammals with hooves, including Hyracotherium, began to graze the lush vegetation that had sprung up in the post-mass extinction world. But in the trees, Archicebus and other early primates evolved to occupy a very different niche. Even though their proto-primate ancestors had also been arboreal, Eocene primates took things a step further and became more highly specialized to thrive in the dense, leafy canopy of forest habitats. Archicebus, for example, would have fed on small insects and fruits, using its grasping hands and feet to navigate through the trees in search of food. And unlike many arboreal animals of its time, which were nocturnal, recent research suggests that Archicebus was diurnal, foraging in the day and sleeping at night. So in a sense, early primates like Archicebus didn't just occupy an empty niche, they created a new one. The arboreal lifestyle they adapted to was a highly specialized ecological role, one that allowed them to escape the fierce competition that would have been common among mammals in the post-extinction world. And in fact, this niche in the forest canopy would continue to shape the evolution of primates. Just as today's adaptable coyotes exploded into urban environments, primates' ability to adapt to new ecological roles and their advanced cognitive abilities became their key evolutionary advantage. It is April 1815. Mount Tambora, a volcano on Sumbawa Island in Indonesia, is erupting. Millions of tons of ash and toxic chemicals are shot into the atmosphere, and deadly pyroclastic flows wipe out entire villages. 71,000 people died, and disruption was felt all over the world. The eruption was, and remains, the worst for over 10,000 years. More than a year later, in Geneva, a group of young writers are on holiday. 18-year-old Mary Godwin was amongst them, along with her lover Percy Shelley and the poet Lord George Byron. Although it was June, the weather was awful. Indeed, the world was still recovering from the Tambora eruption, and 1816 became known as the year without a summer. Forced to stay indoors, the group decided to have a competition for who could write the best scary story. Young Mary came up with the idea of a man who creates sentient life, but flees in terror when his monstrous creation awakens. And she later published the story as a novel, Frankenstein. And so, a volcano oceans away in Indonesia inadvertently sparked the writing of a novel that is now widely considered as the first of the science fiction genre. Sometimes shifts in the climate can have unexpected consequences, and 20 million years ago, changes in the Miocene Earth's climate had knock-on effects that would go on to shape our own evolutionary story, ultimately resulting in the emergence of a whole new lineage. Apes. At nearly 7,000 kilometers long, The River Nile stretches across 11 countries. It is among the longest rivers on Earth and has nourished human civilizations for millennia. With its predictable annual floods, depositing nutrient-rich silt on its banks, agriculture flourished in ancient Egypt, and people used the Nile as a crucial transportation highway. Boats would transport materials for monumental building projects, such as stones for temples and pyramids, as well as goods like papyrus, pottery, and food. But back in the Oligocene, the Nile was very different. Geological studies show that the Nile had its origins around 30 million years ago, when the tectonic uplift of the Ethiopian highlands created a new source of water and sediment for northeast Africa. This uplift, combined with rifting and shifting of the regional fault lines, helped channel rainfall and groundwater northwards, laying the foundation for the Nile's ancient drainage system. Today, the banks of the Nile are green and fertile, but the rest of the region is extremely dry. But back in the Oligocene, the climate of all of Egypt was warm and humid, and there were subtropical forests, mangroves, and swamps. And these thriving habitats, sustained by the ancient watercourses that were developing into the modern Nile, provided ideal conditions for ancestral catarrhine primates to evolve. Around 40 million years ago, haplorhine primates branched off in two different directions, with one lineage giving rise to what we now call the New World monkeys, or platyrrhines, like capuchins and howler monkeys, and the other leading to the Old World monkeys, like baboons, and apes, called catarrhines. New World monkeys are exclusively found in Central and South America, and are thought to have evolved from African ancestors who inadvertently became transatlantic passengers on floating rafts of vegetation after an extreme storm or tsunami. Old World monkeys, however, are found in Africa, Asia, and historically in Europe, and some of the earliest fossil catarrhines were found in North Africa. And so imagine Egypt as it was 30 million years ago, with early catarrhines like Egyptopithecus climbing through a lush forest canopy, feasting on ripe fruit and abundant insects. The abundance and stability of these floodplain forests allowed Egyptopithecus and its relatives to become key links in primate evolution. In fact, it's often believed that this Oligocene species could have been the common ancestor of all modern catarrhines. A 2019 paper, published by Sergio Almasica and his colleagues, found that the shape of the Egyptopithecus hip joint was intermediate between modern monkeys and apes. Apes are characterized by more upright posture, greater flexibility of the shoulder and hip joints, and adaptations for more suspensory, brachiating locomotion, unlike the more quadrupedal limb postures seen in many monkeys. According to the 2019 study, Egyptopithecus retained a primitive quadrupedal climbing style, but also showed key anatomical features that hinted at the way apes move around. And so Egyptopithecus illustrates how changes in anatomy set the stage for the distinct locomotion, social behaviors, and ecological roles seen in today's apes. From their earliest origins in Egypt, the descendants of Egyptopithecus went on to give rise to true apes. But it wouldn't be until the early Miocene, around 23 million years ago, that the earliest fossil apes would appear. It is August 1931. Arthur Hopwood, a British paleontologist, is standing at the edge of an excavation site in western Kenya, near the small town of Koru. Hopwood is here on behalf of the British Museum, and a small tent at the edge of the site has been his home for almost 5 weeks, but he's due to depart in just a few days. Although he misses the creature comforts of his home in London, he will be sorry to leave Kenya, for in the short time he's been here, some truly extraordinary fossils have been found. Many of them are teeth, but there are also pieces of jaw and even skull fragments. Hopwood knows immediately what they are: the bones of long-extinct apes, and among them are the remains of a new species, which Hopwood would later call Proconsul africanus. But not only was Proconsul a new species, it was also one of the earliest apes to ever exist. What sets Proconsul apart as an early ape is its combination of both ape-like and monkey-like features. It lived in Eastern Africa around 21 million years ago, and unlike monkeys, both modern and ancient, Proconsul lacked a tail. Indeed, this is a key difference in the ape lineage, one that all modern apes and humans share. Proconsul also had more flexible limb joints than those of old world monkeys, which is thought to signal a higher emphasis on brachiation or suspensory behavior instead of quadrupedal climbing. However, since Proconsul was a very early ape, it still retained many monkey-like characteristics. Its body had a long, flexible back, still adapted for four-legged locomotion on branches rather than the hanging behavior seen in modern apes. And its skull and teeth, including its large canines, did share traits with today's apes, but did not fully match the pattern we see in great apes like chimpanzees, orangutans, gorillas, or humans. Taken together, this mosaic of features suggests that Proconsul represented a very basal form, right at the beginning of the ape lineage. And so, 21 million years ago, in the early years of the Miocene, you were a basal ape, a transitional creature that blended aspects of the older monkey family and of a new lineage that would eventually give rise to one of the most intelligent and adaptive species on the planet, humans. But before any of that could happen, the early Miocene apes had their own story to tell, for during this period of Earth's history, apes became a vibrant, diverse, and ecologically successful lineage. Indeed, the Miocene fossil record paints a picture of a true planet of the apes. By the Middle Miocene, there were Kenyapithecus, Nacalopithecus, and Kororopithecus living in Africa, but apes were not just restricted to one continent. They had spread far and wide, with Dryopithecus in Europe and Lufengpithecus in Asia. So what exactly was it about the Miocene that made it the perfect time for so many ape species to thrive? Well, just as Frankenstein was born in the fires of a distant volcano, so was our evolution, pushed and pulled by globe-spanning climatic forces. Like the preceding Oligocene and Eocene, the Miocene began as a relatively warm period of time. Temperatures had come down slightly since the Oligocene, but average global temperatures still reached 3 or 4 degrees Celsius warmer than today. Forests stretched across most of Africa, Europe, and Asia, providing the ideal conditions for primates to thrive and diversify. Primates like Pliopithecus could be found as far north as France and Germany, regions that are unsuitable for most non-human primates today because of their lack of fruit and leaves during the winter months. And just as in the Oligocene, the early Miocene was conspicuous in its relative lack of arid environments. In fact, if you were to look down at the early Miocene Earth from space, you'll be only able to spot a few large areas that were not completely green. The rest of the planet, barring Antarctica, was covered in trees, and the tropical zone extended further from the equator than it does today. Indeed, in the early Miocene, the vast Sahara Desert that covers much of northern Africa today didn't exist. Instead, there were forests, swamps, and lake environments for apes to thrive in. But change was on its way. Just as the climate of the Earth had spurred on the rise of the apes, so did its continuous motion bring about their downfall. The Miocene Earth could not stay the same. Gradually, the abundant forests began to retreat, grasslands opened up, and deserts crept back in. This meant the end for many of the previously successful ape genera that had spread across the Old World. But it certainly wasn't the end of the ape lineage in general. For millions of years later, at the end of the Miocene, a new group of apes would have its origins. Around 7 million years ago, in the late Miocene, evolution took a big swing. Ailurochtos was a genus of bears living in what is now southwestern China. Like most bears around today, Ailurochtos was descended from omnivorous ancestors that were adapted to eat a wide range of foods, including meat, fish, insects, fruit, and pretty much anything they could get their paws on. But Ailurochtos was different. It evolved to eat a far more specialized diet, one that heavily featured a single plant: bamboo. This was because, during the late Miocene, central and southwestern China's climate drove a flourishing of its bamboo forests, which in turn encouraged Eilurarctos to shift towards a specialized bamboo diet. At first, this somewhat risky evolutionary journey was a huge success, and Eilurarctos and its descendants were able to spread around much of China. However, today, the giant panda is the only remaining member of this once great lineage. In a sense, Eilurarctos put all their eggs in one unreliable basket, and so because of this hyper-specialization and the destruction of their habitats, giant pandas are now an iconic endangered animal, with only around 2,000 individuals left in the wild. And around the same time that Eilurarctos was evolving its specialized diet in China, another kind of animal was similarly trying something new in northern Africa, but with results that would prove wildly successful. It is July 2001, in the Jurab Desert of northern Chad. This is a truly inhospitable landscape. Yellow-orange dunes and dust stretching as far as the eye can see. At a site called Toros Manala, an international team is in the middle of a breakthrough excavation. So far, they have unearthed several fossil teeth, a few jawbone fragments, and most exciting of all, a skull. It is heavily damaged and will require a lot of painstaking work to reconstruct, but it is remarkably complete, with nearly all of its component bones still present. This skull belonged to a hominin we now know as Sahelanthropus chidensis, an ancient human species thought to be the earliest known member of our evolutionary family, and one who we believe may have walked on two legs. Why? Even though we now associate its home with arid desert landscapes, Chad wasn't always like this. Animal bones at Toros Manala reveal that at least 55 different animal species lived alongside our early hominin ancestors. And so instead of endless desert, imagine a lush green landscape inhabited by early hominins, giraffes, gazelles, elephants, porcupines, and miniature horses. And so why take such a drastic biological risk as bipedalism in an environment as plentiful as this? Indeed, bipedalism is not common in mammals, and surely Sahelanthropus would have got along just fine as a quadruped, just as modern chimpanzees and gorillas do in similar habitats today. While that is probably true, evolution does tend to take a certain course for a reason. Random mutations are common enough, but they don't usually get selected for unless they improve a species' chance for survival. Although 7 million years ago, Chad was a much more suitable habitat for primates than it is today, we need to consider the bigger picture. For paleoclimatological reconstructions show us that by the time of Sahelanthropus, the world was already in the grips of significant climate change. One study, published in the Journal of Human Evolution, analysed fossilized plant remains called phytoliths from 45 sites in northern Chad. The sites ranged in dates from 8 to 1 million years ago, and from the fossil phytoliths, the research team was able to reconstruct the environmental conditions at these sites by analysing what kind of plants were present. The phytolith analysis revealed that at the time of Sahelanthropus, around 7 million years ago, Chad was dominated by mosaic habitats. There were patches of forest, palm groves and grasslands. However, by 4.5 million years ago, the same sites were almost exclusively covered in grass. With the Pleistocene Ice Age, which began 2.5 million years ago just around the corner, hominin environments were already starting to change during this pivotal period in early hominin evolution. Chad in particular was experiencing a decrease in tree cover and an expansion of open savanna, consistent with a shift towards colder, drier conditions, characteristic of ice ages. There are certainly advantages to walking on two legs in the mosaic grass and woodland environments early hominins were generally found in. For one, standing upright allows an animal to see over greater distances. Modern meerkats are a great example of this. Although they are predominantly quadrupedal animals, they are capable of adopting an upright, bipedal posture when on lookout duty. In addition, standing vertically exposes less body surface area to the harsh sun. This could have helped early hominins to regulate their body temperatures and avoid overheating in areas with less tree cover and fewer places to find shade. But this line of thinking isn't without its critics. For some researchers, the fact that early hominins are usually found in mosaic habitats, such as wooded savanna, where there still would have been many trees, means that our earliest ancestors were probably still reliant on forests and woodlands. This, coupled with the presence of arboreal characteristics in early hominin fossils, suggests that they still likely spent a good deal of time in the trees, and walking bipedally through open grassland might not have been a major feature in their daily lives. Indeed, other researchers have suggested that hominin bipedalism could have evolved, not in the open savanna, but in the trees. Professor Kevin Hunt, for example, believes that early hominins adopted an upright posture while foraging and feeding from overhead branches. By standing on two legs, they could use both hands to efficiently gather food that would normally be out of reach or difficult to carry for a quadrupedal primate. Such behavior is seen in wild chimpanzees, which is where Professor Hunt got the idea from. But regardless of the exact reason, the gamble of bipedalism clearly paid off, and by around 4.5 million years ago, there was a new hominin species. Ardipithecus ramidus emerged to the east in what is now Ethiopia. Ardipithecus has adaptations for both walking on two legs and for living in trees. While its pelvis and leg bones were more similar to ours, suggesting that it was a biped, it also had an opposable big toe, adapted for grasping tree branches. Ethiopia was a dangerous place to be a hominin, especially for one that was now taking the risk of spending more and more time outside the safety of the tree branches. Indeed, during the time of Ardipithecus, predators would have been a constant concern. Paleontological finds reveal a wealth of carnivores that lived alongside Ardipithecus, including hyenas, saber-toothed cats, gigantic short-faced bears, and wild dogs. In this carnivore-rich environment, competition among big hunters would have been intense, and there is evidence of high scavenging rates, suggesting that many predators frequently fought over carcasses. And so for Ardipithecus, this meant danger was never far away. And yet, unlike their ape cousins, or their later hominin descendants, Ardipithecus wasn't particularly strong or fast. Modern great apes are equipped with huge canine teeth and are much stronger than us. They're also excellent climbers and can quickly evade predators by darting up a tree. Modern humans, meanwhile, lack the natural weaponry of canine teeth and the tree climbing skills, but we are efficient runners and make tools that can be used to defend against dangerous predators. But Ardipithecus had none of this. They were probably less efficient on two legs than we are, but also not quite as graceful in the trees as modern apes. They had small canine teeth, and no tools are known from 4.4 million years ago. And so with this natural vulnerability, Ardipithecus ramidus may have stuck closer to the trees, where they could quickly clamber away at the first sign of danger. Indeed, going out into open grassland would have been very risky for hominins, although it wasn't long before more and more of them would venture out. In July 2011, a small team of scientists were driving to a dig site near the western shore of Lake Turkana in Kenya. Jason Lewis, a paleoanthropologist, sits in the passenger seat, while archaeologist Sonia Harmond is at the wheel. It's the middle of dry season, so the scientists are able to drive their tough old SUV straight across dry riverbeds. It's very bumpy, but it's also a relatively efficient way to get around a landscape nearly totally devoid of roads. From the passenger seat, Lewis, who has a map laid across the dashboard and a GPS in his hands, tells Harmond to take a left up ahead. She follows his instructions, but soon enough, the SUV runs into a dead end. Lewis squints at the map and quickly realizes his mistake. They have taken a wrong turn. Frustrated, Harmond gets out of the vehicle and scrambles up to the edge of the dry riverbank to take a look around. Suddenly, one of the team, Sammy Lokorodi, sees something and calls the others over to check it out. At first glance, they appear to just be chunks of stone, but to Harmond's trained eyes, though, it is obvious what they are. Tools. their wrong turn had ended with one of the most serendipitous archaeological discoveries ever made. The site the tools were found at is called Lomekwi 3, and the tools have been dated to 3.3 million years ago, making them the oldest stone tools yet found. Tools are one of the hallmarks of our genus. Indeed, almost everything we modern humans do involves some kind of tool, from watching this video to getting dressed in the morning and going to sleep at night. We spend our entire lives surrounded by things that we, or other humans, have made. And it seems that the lives of many of our ancestors were not so different. They also made and used a variety of tools to make their existence easier. A few different primates around the world are known to use tools. Capuchins use stones to crack open shellfish, and chimps have even been seen hunting down bush babies with rudimentary spears. And so, stone tools aren't necessarily a tried and tested signifier of human-like intelligence or above-average survivability. But there is something unique about the ones found at Lomekwi, and a major candidate for the creator of these tools is Australopithecus afarensis. Around 3.9 million years ago, Australopithecus afarensis started roaming the Afar region of Ethiopia. Despite still retaining some adaptations for climbing trees, such as long arms and curved finger bones, Australopithecus afarensis likely spent a lot more time than their ancestors walking around on the ground. And they had bigger brains than those that came before. While Ardipithecus had a brain volume of around 300 to 350 cubic centimeters, similar to a modern chimpanzee, Australopithecus afarensis brains are estimated to have been between 400 and 500 cubic centimeters. And so to create the tools of Lomekwi, a hominin, perhaps Australopithecus, had to select a piece of stone, perhaps taking into account its durability or even aesthetics. Then they had to sit down and chip away at it until it took the shape they wanted. Knapping, which is what archaeologists call the process of making a stone tool, is not easy. It's time-intensive, requires planning and practice, and often results in bleeding fingers, which makes it all the more surprising that creatures with brains a third the size of ours were committing to it. And so though it is impressive that a chimpanzee knows that if they strip the leaves off a tree branch and sharpen it a bit they can go hunting, there is significant cognitive distance between that and what our ancestors were doing at Lomekwi. Since we think that they spent a lot more time on the ground, it's likely that they would have faced plenty of dangers from predators and other animals, just as previous hominins did whenever they ventured down from the trees. However, unlike earlier species, these hominins had something to defend themselves with. A trend to note is that in general, as time went on, hominin teeth got smaller while their brains grew larger. Just compare the size of our canines to those of our closest living relatives, the chimpanzees. This was also the case for Australopithecus afarensis, which suggests that they might have shifted to rely on tools rather than teeth for defense, as well as offense. And it's also around this time that researchers think our ancestors began to eat a lot more meat. So it seems likely that Australopithecus afarensis was also using tools to butcher prey, making them less reliant on plant foods over time, which may have allowed them to finally break free from forested habitats. And so, 3.3 million years ago, you were a tool-making hominin. You and your kin descended from ancestors that took a risk leaving the trees, and now you carefully choose sharp, durable stone and transform it into tools that help you find food, defend yourself, and make your mark on the world. And soon enough, tools would become even more important, as another kind of hominin emerged. Where does the solar system end? Does it end at Neptune, the farthest planet from the Sun? It is roughly 4.5 billion kilometers away, and due to its irregular orbit, it is sometimes even farther than its dethroned sibling Pluto. Pluto was in fact closer to the Sun between 1979 and 1999. So, pretty far, although beyond Neptune lies the Kuiper Belt, home to dwarf planets and many thousands of pieces of rock and frozen gas that also make up the solar system. and the Sun's reach extends much farther than that. The heliosphere, the full extent of its magnetic influence, stretches out to 4 times the distance between the Sun and Neptune. Yet many astrophysicists still do not consider this the edge of the solar system. Over 800 times farther from the Sun is the outer edge of the Oort cloud, theorized to be composed of billions of icy objects that still orbit our home star. To quote astronomer Sean Raymond, "I don't understand how anyone considers anything other than the Oort cloud to be the edge of the solar system. Any other definition seems ludicrous. It is literally the edge of where something can orbit the Sun." In the natural world, boundaries are often fluid, and perspectives can change. It's very hard to tell when one thing ends and another begins. And just as this problem plagues astronomers charting the heavens, so it does biologists, plotting our history. As above, so below. There are around 2 million recognized species on Earth, all of which have been carefully studied and categorized to help us understand them. Indeed, just the primates alone are sorted into at least 504 species. Over the last century, researchers have proposed several methods for drawing boundaries between species. Although the labels differ, they cluster around 3 main questions. Can the populations breed with one another? Can we tell them apart consistently? And how closely related to each other are they? Most distinct species cannot, or do not, interbreed and produce fertile, healthy offspring. Lions and tigers can mate in zoos, but they occupy different habitats and do not breed in the wild. And this biological species concept works fine for living animals, including modern humans. Any 2 living people, even if their ancestors have been on opposite sides of the planet for tens of thousands of years, can produce viable offspring together. We are all, therefore, the same species. But when we bring our ancient relatives and ancestors into the conversation, things become a little more tricky. How do we define the first true humans? 2 million years ago, a hominin stands somewhere in the open plains of eastern Africa. As the sun relentlessly shines down, it feels as if the landscape grows drier with each passing season. Although the hominin doesn't know it, this place was once blanketed by lush forests. His ancestors have lived here for hundreds of generations, and there used to be trees as far as the eye could see, stocked with fruits, insects, and nutritious leaves. But the old habitats are fast retreating. In their place, grasslands are spreading, dotted with only scattered trees and shrubs. This is the Pleistocene, a period of some of the most dramatic environmental upheaval since the end of the Cretaceous. Many people think of this period in Earth's history as the Ice Age, but sediment and ice cores tell us that for the last 2.5 million years or so, our planet has been regularly cycling between glacial periods and interglacials. These profound changes in climate and environment were devastating for much of the world's biodiversity. Forest dwellers were particularly slow to adapt as their habitats gradually disappeared, and genera like the last calicotheres vanished from the fossil record around the boundary of the Plio-Pleistocene. But these challenging conditions also created new opportunities for evolutionary innovations, including the emergence of our own genus, Homo. Carving its way through the Great Rift Valley in Tanzania, Olduvai Gorge is such a distinctive geological feature it can be seen from space. The local Maasai people call it the place of the wild sisal because of the abundant sisal plants that grow there, but also it has another, very different significance. In the early 20th century, much of Eastern Africa was colonially occupied by Germany, which prompted German scientist Wilhelm Kattwinkel to travel there. Kattwinkel was a physician by training, and he went to Tanzania in 1911 to conduct research on sleeping sickness, an infectious disease that causes fever, pain, and trouble sleeping. However, while in Tanzania, Kattwinkel took a trip to Olduvai Gorge and came across many ancient fossils, including the remains of Hipparion, an extinct three-toed horse. News of Kattwinkel's discoveries spread around the scientific community and eventually came to the attention of Hans Reck, a German geologist. He later led a team to Olduvai in 1913, where he unearthed the remains of ancient Homo sapiens. But the most enduring legacy of this find was bringing the gorge at Olduvai to the attention of an up-and-coming archaeologist called Louis Leakey. And through Leakey, our distant past would never be the same. Leakey's investigations at Olduvai began in the 1930s, and with his wife Mary continued for decades, and in 1960 they were accompanied on site by their son Jonathan, who celebrated his 20th birthday while at Olduvai Gorge. And it would be a hot afternoon on May 4th when the young Jonathan suddenly cried out to his parents that he had found something. It was a partial skull, and it was different to anything the Leakeys had seen before. Far less ape-like than the jaws of the Australopiths, it was also not quite like a modern human. Soon enough, more fossils belonging to this individual were found, and it became the first member of a new species, Homo habilis. Alongside Homo habilis, excavations also uncovered a wealth of stone tools, which is why its name translates as handyman. And what's even more significant is that Homo habilis is now considered the earliest species in the Homo genus, which makes it a possible ancestor of everyone alive today, as well as extinct Homo species like the Neanderthals and Denisovans. And that was not all, for when habilis was alive, it may have been one of two distinct Homo species living alongside each other on the African continent, joined as it was by Homo erectus, which may have been descended from habilis and evolved around 2 million years ago. But of course these weren't the only hominins that lived in Africa at this time. In fact, the African record during the early Pleistocene is strikingly crowded. Field teams working in eastern and southern Africa have showed that at least 4 other hominin species overlapped with Homo erectus and Homo habilis, and a 5th probably vanished just before Homo habilis came along. In eastern Africa, Paranthropus boisei, with their impressive jaws, had already been established for some 300,000 years, while its sister species, Paranthropus robustus, lived south of the Zambezi. Paranthropus aethiopicus lived around 2.5 million years ago, right at the beginning of the Pleistocene. Meanwhile, South Africa was the stronghold of Australopithecus africanus and Australopithecus sediba. And so with so many hominin species running around the African continent, what exactly made Homo different? Historically, the clearest adaptive signal for the Homo genus has been brain size. When Homo habilis was first scientifically described in 1964, Louis Leakey, Philip Tobias, and John Napier set the boundary for brain size in Homo at 600 cubic centimeters. But the first cracks in this thinking came from East Turkana in Kenya. For KNM-ER 1813, a fossil skull universally regarded as Homo habilis has a capacity of only 510 cubic centimeters, but its facial profile, cranial shape, and teeth slot it securely within the Homo habilis species. Indeed, even early Homo erectus experienced this kind of significant brain size variation. A cranium from Dmanisi, designated D4500, has a capacity of a mere 546 cubic centimeters, which makes it dramatically smaller than the standard for erectus, but otherwise seems to match the expected craniodental proportions for the species. Small brain species, like Homo floresiensis and Homo naledi, have weakened the boundary even further. Homo floresiensis, with a cranial capacity of only 400 cubic centimeters, made complex stone technology, and Homo naledi has been speculated to have buried their dead, and yet had brains of only 465 cubic centimeters. And so, today, paleoanthropologists do not rely on brain measurements alone when they decide that a fossil belongs to our genus. Throughout ancient skeletons, and even in the objects they left behind, there are other recurring clues that set early humans apart from the other hominins that shared their world. A good place to start is the face and jaws. In every accepted member of Homo, the lower portion of the face is flatter than it is in other hominins and apes. In addition, the cheeks are less flared. That reshaping goes with a reduction of the chewing apparatus, which includes our canines. These became much less prominent in Homo, and our smaller molars and premolars, and even the roots that anchor our teeth to our jaws, shrunk down and became more slender. Move down to the hands. Our thumbs are long, strong, and pivot on a saddle-shaped joint that allows the tip to sweep across the pads of the fingers and form a precision grip. Homo habilis already shows this arrangement. Although its finger bones are slightly curved, they end in broad, flat tips that suggest it would have been capable of pinching and fine tool manipulation, and the rest of the skeleton follows suit. As soon as Homo erectus appears in the fossil record, we see an immediate shift towards more modern body proportions. Indeed, from the neck down, Homo erectus was functionally indistinguishable from 21st century humans. They were taller than other contemporary hominins and noticeably narrow-hipped. Their arms were shorter, while their legs grew longer and their limb joints became bigger and stronger to deal with the stresses of travelling long distances on two legs. In short, they were endurance runners. And these anatomical shifts were accompanied by behavioural changes. Before the Leakeys discovered Homo habilis in Olduvai Gorge, they had discovered a new kind of stone tool. They named them Oldowan tools, and Mary Leakey produced schematic drawings of them. Mary's systematic excavation and documentation at tool sites in Olduvai Gorge revealed stratified layers where tools appeared in association with animal bones bearing cut marks, revealing that Oldowan tools were primarily used for cutting, scraping, and butchering meat. Although simple to our eyes, they had sharper edges from more controlled stone knapping than the Lamecrian industry from 3.3 million years ago, and would have made the task of butchering animals for the meat a lot more straightforward. Homo erectus, meanwhile, is associated with a different stone tool industry, known as the Acheulean. It starts showing up in the archaeological record 1.76 million years ago, and features the iconic bifacial hand axe, a generally symmetrical, almost teardrop-shaped tool that could be used for a multitude of different tasks. With these trusty hand axes, Homo erectus could probably take down large prey, and would have made short work of their carcasses. Indeed, we often assume that our hominin ancestors were more limited in their creative and technical skills, but anyone who has ever attempted to create their own hand axe can tell you that they are not easy to make. In fact, it can take years of training and dedicated practice to achieve the kind of precision we see in Acheulean hand axes. This complexity suggests an advancement in the cognitive capabilities and fine motor control of Homo erectus compared to their predecessors. And given that their brains were often not that much smaller than our own, at around 1,000 cubic centimeters, perhaps this increased intelligence shouldn't come as a surprise. And it was also during the time of Homo erectus that the earliest evidence for the controlled use of fire began to appear at sites like Kubifora and Swartkrans. Taken together, this evidence reveals a package of adaptations that distinguish the Homo genus from other hominins. Although many scientists have argued that Homo erectus, with their runners' bodies, big brains, and use of fire and complex tools, are more deserving of being part of our genus than Homo habilis, who some argue should be reclassified as Australopithecus habilis. And so, as with the edge of our solar system, drawing a line in the sand in the natural world is never straightforward. But on the whole, a little more than 2 million years ago, you were a human. Standing with modern body proportions, exploring the globe, and using ever more advanced tools. But of course, this would not be the end of the human journey. Several more species, including our own, would arise within the Homo genus to live alongside, and perhaps even compete with one another. A battle is being fought. Two men face one another in a frosty landscape somewhere in Western Europe. One is tall, lean, and quick on his feet. The other is short, stocky, and powerful. They circle warily. The shorter man, a Neanderthal, lunges with a heavy spear, but the taller man, a Homo sapien, slips aside. The Neanderthal's breath is coming harder. His energy is fading. He hasn't eaten since the day before. The animals he relies on for food are increasingly rare, chased down by these new hominin arrivals. Another thrust, but the modern human counters swiftly. The blow glances off, but the force jars through the Neanderthal's arm and he feels something crack. Finally, the Neanderthal staggers away, clutching his broken limb and vanishing into the forest. Scenes like this may once have played out countless times across Ice Age Eurasia. Modern humans, our ancestors, were expanding into new lands, but they weren't empty. Neanderthals already lived in Europe and Western Asia, while Denisovans populated the East. They had long been unchallenged in these territories, but now they had company. We know from fossil DNA that interbreeding happened between these populations. Indeed, all humans on Earth still carry the legacy of these encounters in our genes. But that wasn't the whole story. The archaeological and skeletal records also suggest a darker side: conflict. Many Neanderthal skeletons bear the scars of violence: fractured arms and shattered skulls, trauma consistent with parrying attacks and blows to the head. And yet, for all the clashes that might have taken place, the differences between these groups of ancient people were surprisingly small. After all, they were all descended from a common ancestor and bred with each other. So who was this mysterious common ancestor, and what caused these branches of the human family to split and go their separate ways? It is 1993 and a chilly day in West Sussex. 32-year-old archaeologist Mark Roberts is digging a small pit. He sighs, remembering how, just a few years ago, this same stretch of land had been bustling with an excavation team, all up to their elbows in the muddy orange clay that lay just beneath the pasture. Roberts, who had been directing fieldwork here at Boxgrove since he was in his early 20s, had overseen the discoveries of thousands of flint tools and the bones of many extinct animals: ancient horses, rhinoceroses, deer, and even lions and bears. But now all the funding has dried up and excavations have ended. Roberts has been told there's nothing left to find, but he can't quite let Boxgrove go. Something about the site never sat right with him, because despite the wealth of tools that were discovered, no one has yet found any human remains. So, over 3 years after official fieldwork came to an end, Roberts and a handful of other dedicated excavators are back, convinced that Boxgrove has more to give. And it doesn't take long for them to be proven right. That day in 1993, Roberts and his small team discovered the lower leg bone of a human, a man who died almost 500,000 years ago. He belonged to a species that emerged long before our own, and that may have been our shared ancestor with Neanderthals and Denisovans, Homo heidelbergensis. And so nearly 500,000 years ago, you were a member of a species that faced a great crossroads. Your kind would spread across the globe and evolve into many different forms. Some would inhabit the lands to the north, what is now Europe. They eventually become the Neanderthals. Some would travel east to Asia and become the Denisovans. But most remained in the African heartland, where they would evolve into us, Homo sapiens. So far, scientists have been able to confidently date Homo heidelbergensis fossils to between 600,000 and 300,000 years ago, during a time called the Middle Pleistocene. The Homo heidelbergensis bone found at Boxgrove in West Sussex is the oldest known hominin fossil from so far north in Europe. It suggests that heidelbergensis was already widespread around the globe by this time, but the Boxgrove man is far from the oldest representative of his species. That honour officially goes to Mauer 1, a mandible dug up at a German sand mine in the early 1900s, which is approximately 600,000 years old. Both of these fossils are from Europe, and so is this where Homo heidelbergensis first evolved? Not according to recent evidence. In 2016, a reanalysis of an old discovery showed that although there are many ancient heidelbergensis fossils found in Europe, the species actually emerged in Africa. Back in the 1970s, researchers digging in Gombore in Ethiopia discovered skull fragments belonging to a mystery hominin. The sediment around the fossils is 875,000 years old. So they assumed the hominin was a Homo erectus, since no other hominin was known to exist in Africa at that time. But a closer look by a new team in 2016 found that things were not quite that simple. By comparing the shape of the skull fragments with others in the fossil record, the team found that the fragments were intermediate in shape between late Homo erectus and early Homo heidelbergensis. This means that the Gombore skull belonged to someone who wasn't quite a Homo erectus, but also wasn't yet a Homo heidelbergensis. They were somewhere in the middle, a transitional being, at the very beginning of a new species. But why do scientists think Homo heidelbergensis was our last common ancestor? Well, as the Gombore skull demonstrates, Homo heidelbergensis likely descended from Homo erectus, and the species generally displays a mix of traits associated with both erectus and later species like the Neanderthals and Homo sapiens. Evolution, however, is rarely neat, and Homo heidelbergensis lived during the Middle Pleistocene, a period of time that is notoriously confusing for anyone trying to piece together the puzzle of human evolution. It's so complex, in fact, that paleoanthropologists call it the muddle in the middle. It's not clear why, but between around 900,000 and 600,000 years ago, right as Homo heidelbergensis was likely emerging, hominin fossils suddenly become rare and fragmentary. To add another layer of complexity, there's often confusing overlap between different species. For instance, early Neanderthals can be mistaken for late surviving Homo heidelbergensis, and as with the Gombore skull fragments, early heidelbergensis might be mistaken for Homo erectus. And as well as this, as we've seen with identifying the very first humans, the mosaic nature of evolution can make the distinctions between them blurry. Also, fossil hominins are sometimes known only from a handful of remains. A finger bone here, a few teeth there. Maybe a jawbone or a piece of skull if excavators are lucky. A famous example of this is the Denisovans, who were discovered in 2010 through genetic analysis of a tiny finger bone. And so without a complete skeleton or any genetic data, researchers don't have the full picture, and are forced to make inferences based on isolated anatomical features. Indeed, even subtle differences, like the thickness of bones or the curvature of a tooth, can be interpreted in very different ways. With researchers being forced to focus on scattered, minute details, a long list of potential Middle Pleistocene species has emerged over time. Aside from Homo heidelbergensis and Homo bodoensis, there are also Homo rhodesiensis and Homo antecessor, all living at roughly the same time and possessing similar yet slightly different features. The problem is, Homo heidelbergensis was an incredibly widespread species, just like Homo erectus before it and Homo sapiens after. Although they originated in Africa, they spread across huge swathes of the Old World. Boxgrove seems to be the extent of their northern range, but they may also have been found as far east as Dali in China. Being so widely spread across the globe, many argue that anatomical variation was inevitable. So could it be possible that all these differing proposed species, Bodoensis, Rhodesiensis and Antecessor, are actually all just variations of Homo heidelbergensis? Many scientists now think that this is the case, and that regional diversity was just particularly strong in this species. Homo heidelbergensis, therefore, was not a monolithic creature. It was a species that changed as it spread across the globe. Where they made their homes and what environmental pressures they dealt with inevitably shaped different populations. And over time, these regional populations diverged, drifted, and adapted into many distinct forms. In Africa, Homo heidelbergensis could have given rise to Homo sapiens, an evolutionary trajectory that is reflected in their anatomy: rounder craniums, more subtle brow ridges, and smaller noses. Meanwhile, in Europe, Homo heidelbergensis may have been evolving down a different path towards Neanderthals. The colder weather could have given them more robust bodies and thicker bones, while their craniums retained the more primitive, long, low shape. And a very similar story likely played out in Asia, where another species, the Denisovans, split off from a different population of Homo heidelbergensis. Although it was long assumed that other hominin species were more archaic than us, Evidence now suggests that many of the behaviours we once considered unique to our species, like art and language, were present in Neanderthals, and probably were in Denisovans too. But what's even more intriguing is that these behaviours could have already been present over 500,000 years ago in Homo heidelbergensis. Buried in a waterlogged layer of coal at Schöningen in Germany, a set of long wooden spears laid for over 400,000 years until they were unearthed in the 1990s. Looking at them now, they are practically indistinguishable from something a modern human would make, except that they were made by Homo heidelbergensis. They were expertly sharpened, carefully tapered, and balanced like javelins. One even had a sharpened, fire-hardened point. To make something like this takes vision. You have to choose the right tree, shape it, and straighten it. Wood isn't like stone, it bends and splits. It's alive and needs understanding to work with. And indeed, Homo heidelbergensis used wood for more than just weaponry. In 2023, a discovery was made that rewrote what we thought about heidelbergensis. On the banks of the Kalambo River, near the edge of the Zambian plateau, archaeologists found 2 interlocking wooden logs that were shaped with deliberate notches. One log had been carved to fit snugly across the other, forming an architectural join, one that was at least 476,000 years old. That made it the oldest evidence of a wooden structure in human history. Researchers aren't exactly sure what the structure was. It could have been a platform, a walkway, or even a shelter. But whatever it was, it shows that Homo heidelbergensis could visualize and manipulate the world in 3 dimensions. They were doing a lot more than just reacting to their environment. They were changing it. And buried within this long history of technological skill and environmental adaptation lies an even more enigmatic piece of evidence: the engraved elephant bone from Bilsingsleben, Germany. Dating back around 350,000 to 400,000 years, this beautifully etched ivory fragment is considered one of the earliest known examples of symbolic behavior among archaic humans, likely associated with Homo heidelbergensis or very close relatives. The bone bears deliberately incised groups of parallel lines in 2 distinct sets, with regular spacing and carefully formed grooves. These patterns are widely interpreted as intentional engravings rather than accidental scratches. But what makes this engraving so significant is its deeper implication. It signals that Homo heidelbergensis possessed the cognitive capacity not only for tool use and survival, but for symbolic thought, planning, and perhaps even rudimentary communication beyond practical needs. These engravings hint that the root of human symbolic culture stretched back far earlier than previously believed, and well before the appearance of Homo sapiens. For so long, we have drawn the boundary of what it means to be human at our own species. But Homo heidelbergensis proves that the boundary line could be much older. However, even the most adaptable species can't stick around forever. Soon, Homo heidelbergensis would vanish from the fossil record, and 3 new lineages would take its place. But when did our own species, Homo sapiens, emerge? Where have archaeologists found the earliest Homo sapiens remains, and what did these ancestral people look like? And of course, finally, what was it about them that ensured that they survived, while our close cousins, the Neanderthals and Denisovans, all died out? It is late August 1939, and geologist Otto Volzing is working on an excavation at Hollenstein-Stadel, a cave in southern Germany. Buried in the ancient sediments, he uncovers hundreds of ivory fragments. The find is exciting, but it's difficult to tell what it actually is, so he has the fragments sent off to a local museum, intending for them to be analysed. However, mere days later, on September the 1st, World War II breaks out. Hitler invades Poland. Fieldwork at Hollenstein-Stadel is abandoned, and the fragments are shoved in a storeroom, forgotten. And they stay there long after the war ends, until archaeologist Joachim Hahn starts taking inventory of the museum stores. Curious about the ivory fragments, he wonders if he can fit them back together, like an ancient jigsaw puzzle. Gradually, as he does so, a figure takes shape. The body of a human, standing tall and upright, with the head of a cave lion. A fantastical creature that the figure's maker had to imagine into being. Today we know the figure as the Lauenmensch, the lion person, and it's been dated to 41,000 years ago. It's one of the oldest known examples of artistic symbolic expression and the oldest confirmed statue ever found. Around the same time that the people of Hollensteinstadel were carving the Lauenmensch, other groups across Europe were painting animals and patterns on cave walls. At Cueva del Castillo in the Cantabrian region of Spain, people used red ochre to create hand stencils and draw a bison. At Grotte Chauvet in southern France, people recreated scenes from around them, painting incredibly lifelike horses, rhinos, deer, and lions. And so to many archaeologists, it looked like this art signaled the beginning of a new period in human prehistory around 40,000 years ago, and Europe appeared to be at its centre. Scholars started talking about a revolution when our ancestors suddenly became behaviourally modern. But was this really the whole story? About 50 kilometres southeast of Safi, a small city on the western coast of Morocco, is a site called Jebel Irhoud. Until relatively recently, Jebel Irhoud was a cave, but it now lies open to the blazing North African sun. In the 1960s, the rocky foothills of the Atlas Mountains saw intense mining, and Jebel Irhoud had its entire ceiling removed. And yet despite the destruction, it was during this intense mining activity that a valuable human fossil was discovered. It was a skull, and the miner who found it gave it to the University of Rabat. Intrigued, the university then organised an expedition to the site, led by anthropologist Emile Enouki. As it was the 1960s, Enouki and his team used explosives to uncover the archaeological layers they were interested in, but still managed to recover a further 2 hominin fossils, which were interpreted to be an adult and a child. The excavation also unearthed a number of stone tools in situ. Enouki thought they looked like Neanderthal tools, and so he initially assigned the fossils to the Neanderthal species. This was the first in a long list of confusions surrounding Jebel Irhoud. Indeed, the hominin remains do resemble Neanderthals in several ways, but Neanderthals are first and foremost a Eurasian species. They've been found as far south as Gibraltar, but appear to have never set foot into Africa. Then came the problem of dating the finds. Techniques for figuring out the age of fossils and archaeological materials were limited in the 1960s, so Enouki tried what was available to him. At the time, this was radiocarbon dating, but this technique can only date material that is 50,000 years old or younger, and the remains from Jebel Irhoud were older than that. And nobody knew quite how old until 2017, when a team led by the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology carried out thermoluminescence dating on the Jebel Irhoud assemblage. Some of the tools at the site had been burned, so the Max Planck team were able to find out when the burning took place. By proxy, this provided a minimum age for the other tools and the hominin remains that were buried next to them. And to everybody's surprise, the burnt tools were 315,000 years old. So were these 315,000-year-old Neanderthals living in North Africa, or were they something else? Right from the beginning, the Jebel Irhoud fossils were seen as an oddity. The skull has a long cranium, a strong brow ridge, and relatively large teeth. However, it also has plenty of more derived features that look similar to our own, like delicate cheekbones, a slightly rounded brain case, and a smaller nose. Some researchers suggested that the Jebel Irhoud hominins could have been Neanderthal-Sapien hybrids, which would explain their curious mix of features. But the leading hypothesis is even more surprising. These hominins were our ancestors, a group of some of the earliest Homo sapiens to emerge. These early sapiens didn't have all the physical characteristics of our species because 315,000 years ago, they hadn't evolved yet. This new discovery of old evidence was big news. Until 2017, the oldest known Homo sapien fossils came from Homo kibish, An Ethiopian site then dated to 195,000 years ago. Jebel Irhoud therefore pushed back the origin of our species by over 100,000 years. And since then, the fossils from Homo kibish have also been revealed to be older than we thought, dating to around 233,000 years old. So what were the Homo sapiens like at Homo kibish? Were they similar to the people from Jebel Irhoud, or were they different? The excavation team at Homo kibish uncovered the remains of two individuals, Homo 1 and Homo 2. Unlike their more ancient relatives from Jebel Irhoud in Morocco, the Homo humans are classified as anatomically modern. That means that Homo 1 and 2 were close to indistinguishable from 21st century people. They have the characteristic globular brain case, subtle brow ridge, and pointy chin, amongst other things. The expansion and rounding of the brain case is especially significant. It reflects a reorganization of the brain, particularly areas linked to visuospatial integration, memory, and social cognition, which could have given them an adaptive edge in the rapid shifts between wet and dry phases happening between 400,000 and 100,000 years ago. Researchers have also proposed a Pan-African model for the evolution of anatomically modern humans. As African environments fragmented under climate pressure, populations of early Homo sapiens would have become isolated in different ecological niches. These pockets of isolation may have lasted thousands of years, allowing local populations to evolve distinctive traits. When more stable climatic conditions returned and habitats recovered, those populations could then merge and exchange genetic material. This scenario suggests that Homo sapiens did not necessarily arise from a single cradle, but from multiple interconnected populations across the African continent, with each contributing different anatomical traits. Jebel Irhoud in the northeast, Homo kibish in the east, and another site, Florisbad in the south. Each represents a distinct population that was maybe part of a continent-wide evolutionary mosaic. And physical, genetic traits weren't the only things to be exchanged by these populations. Human technology gradually began to change as well. At Jebel Irhoud, we see people using an entirely new approach to toolmaking. One of the best-known methods from this period is called the Levallois technique. Rather than simply chipping away at a piece of stone to produce a cutting edge, the Levallois toolmakers carefully shaped a stone core so they could remove a single, well-formed flake with a single strike. The result was a thin, sharp flake that could be further retouched into points, scrapers, or blades. People also began to experiment with hafting, attaching stone points to wooden shafts to create composite tools like spears and knives. In some cases, they even used plant resins as adhesives. Over time, distinctive regional traditions emerged. In North Africa, there was the Aterian industry, characterized by tanged points that could be fitted onto handles. In Southern Africa, later Middle Stone Age industries like Still Bay and Howison's Port produced finely worked spear points and tiny razor-sharp blades known as microliths, which were likely mounted in handles made from wood, bone, or ivory. So not only does the Pan-African hypothesis explain how the physical traits of Homo sapiens evolved, but it could also explain our behavioral and technological evolution. It's clear that physical and behavioral modernity wasn't a sudden development, but a gradual coming together of populations, a sharing of genes, knowledge, and culture. And while all this was happening, Homo sapien populations were growing and expanding into new territories. By around 200,000 years ago, small bands of early humans had already begun to explore new environments beyond their African homelands. Indeed, the earliest evidence for Homo sapiens outside Africa comes from a cave in southern Greece. Although sites like Aberdima Cave are few and far between, and it wouldn't be until much later, around 70,000 years ago, that Homo sapiens truly began to colonize the world. They followed the shifting grasslands and coastlines that opened up during colder, drier periods, gradually making their way across the Arabian Peninsula into the Levant and onwards into Europe and East Asia. As they migrated across this new world, they encountered other human species, Neanderthals and Denisovans. For a time, these different species lived alongside each other. Sometimes there was conflict, and sometimes there was cooperation, but there's no getting around the fact that by around 40,000 years ago, we were the only human species left. Not long after the arrival of Homo sapiens in Eurasia, both the Neanderthal and Denisovan population began to shrink until they eventually went extinct. The reason why is hotly debated, but our Homo sapiens ancestors likely played a big part. Some researchers suggest that competitive exclusion took place. This is the idea that Homo sapiens outcompeted their Neanderthal and Denisovan cousins for land and resources. Others point to the instability of the climate during the last ice age, which could have pushed small, isolated populations of Neanderthals and Denisovans beyond the point of recovery. But whatever the reason, Homo sapiens became the sole human survivor of the late Pleistocene. And as time went by and our ancestors expanded into more new territories, they encountered new challenges and endured some of the harshest conditions humanity has ever faced. Around 26,000 years ago, the world entered the last glacial maximum, the coldest, driest, and least forgiving phase of the last ice age. Impenetrable ice sheets smothered huge swathes of the northern hemisphere, dropping global temperatures and significantly lowering sea levels. Land that was once part of the sea floor suddenly became exposed, which created land bridges between previously disconnected regions and altered coastlines beyond recognition. Indeed, some even think this is how certain populations made it into North America, by travelling over a land bridge called Beringia that connected Siberia to Alaska. Survival in this harsh, glacial world demanded adaptability and ingenuity, and our ancestors rose to meet the challenge. Indeed, the last glacial maximum was a time of many firsts. The first known tailored clothing, the first confirmed houses, the first pottery. Life for most people would have been hard, but for a select few, life perhaps became more lavish. A burial discovered at Sungir in Russia contains 2 children, laid head to foot, covered in red ochre, and accompanied by high-value items like finely carved spears and clothing that had over 13,000 ivory beads sewn into it. Clearly, a huge amount of effort went into burying these bodies, despite their young age. This makes researchers think that perhaps burials like this reflect the origins of hierarchical societies, the division of wealth, and inherited status. And this was a trend that would continue long after the ice retreated. By roughly 12,000 years ago, the climate was warming and a new epoch began. This was the Holocene, the period we are currently living in. The world gradually transformed, with forests spreading across the previously grassy steppes and rivers swelling with meltwater. With a much more stable climate and generally warm temperatures, some populations around the world began to settle down. In the Levant, otherwise known as the Fertile Crescent, people experimented with growing crops and keeping the livestock. Soon, as people put more time and effort into producing their own food, instead of foraging or hunting for it, the first villages, towns, and even cities sprang up. Although in other regions, including in Britain and the US, people remained nomadic for many thousands of years, maintaining their traditions of hunting, fishing, and gathering. And so Homo sapiens would go on to raise monuments like Stonehenge, create the first written word, and build megacities. Everything we associate with our species, from writing and philosophy to science, architecture, and art, proliferated in the Holocene. But we cannot forget what led us to this point. Our story stretches back far beyond the Holocene, beyond the Ice Ages, and even beyond the first appearance of Homo sapiens. We are part of a much longer, much older tale, one that stretches back billions of years to when single-celled organisms first appeared in Earth's ancient oceans. It is a story of endurance and adaptation, of conflict and cooperation, of innovation and creativity. and it's a story that's far from over. You've been watching the entire history of humankind. Don't forget to like and subscribe and leave us a comment to tell us what you think. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.